Welcome to this video. Today we talk about Pedro Rodrigues Filho. Make sure you are subscribe and like. Let's get started. Introduction. Pedro Rodrigues Filho, better known as Pedrinho Matador, Pedro the Killer, is one of the most infamous and complex figures in recent Brazilian history. His name is often mentioned in stories about the darkest sides of society and the fine line between justice and revenge. But who is Pedro Rodrigues Filho really? What are the circumstances that led him to become the man he was? And what did he himself claim about his actions? This is the story of a man who saw himself as an avenger, but whose motives remain controversial. Early years. Pedro Rodrigues Filho was born on July 17, 1954, in Santa Rita do Sapucaí, a town in southern Brazil. His early years were far from normal. Pedro was born into a family that soon began to suffer from violent circumstances. His father was an abusive man who mistreated both him and his mother. In some versions of the story, it's even claimed that Pedro had a difficult start even during his mother's pregnancy, as his father abused her. The violence in his family was, according to many, a key factor contributing to his later behavior. As a child, Pedro was often confronted with his father's violent behavior, which ultimately motivated him to resist everything he perceived as injustice. The first act of violence. At a young age, Pedro began to resist the violence surrounding him. It's rumored that he committed his first murder at the age of 14, possibly in response to the violent conditions he experienced at home. His first victim was said to be a man who had attacked his mother. Pedro, armed with a knife, allegedly killed him to avenge his mother. This early act of violence marked the beginning of a life dominated by violence and revenge. The first murders he committed were, according to Pedro, a way of eliminating those he considered evil. This sense of justice was something he would repeat throughout his life. The pattern of murders. The exact number of murders Pedro Rodrigues Filho actually committed is difficult to determine, but estimates range from dozens to more than 100. What made his crimes particularly striking was that he never saw himself as a criminal. Instead, he considered himself someone who was cleansing society of those he deemed criminals. He often targeted other criminals and corrupt individuals, but according to some accounts, he also killed innocent people. However, it wasn't just the nature of his victims that attracted attention, but also the brutality with which he carried out his murders. Pedro frequently used a knife and became known for the detailed, almost ritualistic way he killed his victims. This made him a figure who, to many, resembled an anti-hero, someone who took the law into his own hands to bring what he believed was justice. Imprisonment. In 1973, Pedro was arrested for the first time. He had killed several people and was charged with murder. Throughout his time in prison, Pedro continued to commit most of his violent acts. It is even said that he murdered fellow inmates while incarcerated, further enhancing his reputation as a man without mercy. During his time behind bars, Pedro never changed his attitude. He continued to assert that he acted out of a sense of justice, believing he was bringing justice to a corrupt society. His life story became a symbol of the question of whether violence is ever justified, even when driven by the desire for justice. The controversy around his motives. One of the most fascinating aspects of Pedro Rodrigues Filho's story is the question of whether he was a psychopath or someone actually seeking justice. While some saw him as a monster, others regarded him as a kind of avenger who fought against a corrupt and violent society. Pedro himself always insisted that he did not act out of personal hatred but to eliminate evil. His view of society was that it was filled with people who did not respect the law, and that it was his task to stop them, even if it meant ending their lives. His justification for murder raises questions about the line between justice and violence, and whether anyone in his situation could have made different choices. Release from prison. After spending many years in prison, Pedro Rodrigues Filho was eventually released in 2003. This happened because, according to the laws at the time, he had the right to be conditionally released after serving a long sentence. His release was met with much controversy. Many found it difficult to understand how someone with such a violent past could be allowed to walk free. Pedro himself had mixed feelings about his release. On the one hand, he was happy to be free again, but on the other hand, he still held on to his belief that society was filled with people who did not obey the law. He was often seen in the media, where he told his story and justified his actions. This sparked much debate in Brazil about how the legal system handles individuals who have committed such serious crimes. What can we learn from the story of Pedrinho Matador? The story of Pedro Rodrigues Filho raises many questions about morality, justice, and how we deal with criminals. Was he just a violent man, or was he a product of his circumstances? Did he truly seek justice, or was he simply a murderer? This story continues to fascinate people around the world because it forces us to think about the thin line between right and wrong, and whether some actions can ever be justified, no matter how brutal they may be. Conclusion: Pedro Rodrigues Filho, or Pedrinho Matador, is one of the most intriguing and controversial figures in recent Brazilian history. His life and actions remain a subject of discussion and reflection. His story is not just a tale of violence, but also a journey of seeking justice, and how our personal experiences can shape the people we become. Whether one sees him as an avenger or a murderer, Pedro Rodrigues Filho remains a figure who is difficult to understand, but whose story we cannot ignore. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.